Hello everyone, welcome to Digital Debates by TRT World Forum. My name is Merve Akin and I'm researcher at TRT World Research Center. Today's session is Iran and regional uprisings as part of the series A Decade into the Arab Spring, Past Reflections and Future Projections. This year, since February, we have discussed the dynamics, trajectories, obstacles, and future prospects of Arab states like Libya, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, and more. Now we are here to discuss the role of very significant actor in the region. Iran continues its long-standing policy of exploiting regional dynamics for its own benefit. Tehran's bellicose and sectarian policies have managed to establish a network of acquiescent regimes and non-state actors in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Such a constellation of actors is ever more reliant on Iranian influence. With today's discussion, we will explore the spoiler role played by Iran and its complicity in seeing the aspirations of Arab populations foiled. So, for discussing this issue, three gentlemen are joining today. Let me introduce them before the start. Bara Shiban is a Yemeni analyst and a caseworker with the human rights group Review. He has served as an advisor to the Yemeni embassy in London. Prior to this role, he was Reprieve Yemen project coordinator, working on investigating US drone strikes. He has also served as a member of the Yemen National Dialogue between 2013 and 14. Welcome to Mr. Shiban. And we have Scott Lucas, is a professor of emeritus of international politics at the University of Birmingham. He covers US and British foreign policy as well as current international affairs in North Africa, the Middle East, and Iran. He's the founder and editor of EA Worldview, one of the leading news and analysis sites on US foreign policy and international affairs. He's a member of the advisory board of the Center for American Studies and Research at American University of Beirut, and he has been also adjunct professor of the Institute for North American and European Studies at the University of Tehran. Welcome, Professor Lucas. And lastly, we have Talha Abdulrazak. He is a counterterrorism and security expert at the University of Exeter in England, and he is also winner of the 2015 Al Jazeera Young Researcher Award. He completed his BA in War Studies at King's College London and MA in Middle East Politics at the University of Exeter. Talha has published academic works on Iraq, ISIS, the risk of sectarian terrorism in the country. Thank you all for being today. So without any further delay, I would like to open up with you, Bara. So the war in Yemen is often portrayed as a proxy conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. However, people seem to have almost forgotten how it all started. The Houthi coup in 2014 was not just directed at President Mansour Hadi, but some would say it was directed against the whole pro-democracy movement. The Houthis turned on their own partners in the Yemeni National Dialogue, and during the coup, they even formed an alliance with the late autocrat Ali Abdullah Saleh before eventually killing him. Some would say that both Iran and Saudi Arabia were against the democratic process in Yemen, but while Riyadh ultimately did not act to save Saleh's dictatorship, Tehran succeeded in effectively ending the democratic aspirations in the country. Is this a fair assessment of what took place? What do you think?
I mean, as you can realize, the situation in Yemen is a mirage of different complexities and a lot of internal grievances that eventually came up to the surface in the 2011 uprising. It's more of a failure of the central government, the notion of the modern nation state in achieving the aspirations of its own nation for quite many decades. Now, the rise of the Houthis, I think, was a joint failure to not just by the neighboring countries of Yemen, but also by the political, I would say, the political structure within Yemen failed to see that rise as a significant threat to any peaceful or political resolution that would hopefully move the country, if not closer to democracy, but something closer to more representation, more of an elections, more an idea of a nation of good governance, something that is at least representative of what was happening inside Yemen, representative of the people. Now, in 2011, the first rise of the Houthis is simply because the young generation of young youth who are more aspiring towards democracy and change saw the Houthis as less of a threat, but mainly they were aspired by their revolutionary attitude towards the state. The Houthis didn't struck as a force that can destabilize the whole nation. But only a few years later, this is when the complexity started to come across together, because they were playing alliances against each other. They were effective into bringing up sectarian and regional tensions within Yemen, and I mean internal regional tensions within the country, until eventually, because of all playing with all of those contradictions, eventually managed to launch the coup against the Yemeni government first in 2014, but then against the whole political infrastructure within Yemen a few months later. That coup by itself prevented the Yemeni people from having first the elections that was set to happen within. It was supposed to happen with either February or April 2015, and then it also prevented the Yemeni people from having the referendum on the outcomes of the national dialogue. The outcomes of the national dialogue, which should have moved the system from being a central form of governance into a federal system, and then hopefully moving into a more of a parliamentarian system. But all of that, of course, all of those aspirations and demands of the young youth who went out to the streets in 2011 were gone, because any civil society, any political movement, any pro-democratic movement, you need the state institutions to exist so you can work within that framework. The rhetoric changed completely after 2014, and then we started to hear that the Houthis will actually bring the country closer to Tehran, closer to Iran in terms of its foreign relations, and then also doing military maneuvers with the border with Saudi Arabia, and that tipped the conflict from just being an inter or just an intra-Yemeni conflict into becoming more of a regional tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the success of the Yemen model of being to move towards this political transformation and the political resolution, and was hailed even by President Obama as a success model that can be a model for other Arab Spring countries, was based on the fact that it should not be driven to those regional tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The regional countries should be encouraged to keep supporting the transition in the country. However, that takeover by the Houthis, and then pushing the foreign relations with bringing the government closer to Iran, and then conducting military maneuvers with the border with Saudi Arabia, tipped the civil conflict into becoming a regional one.
Thank you, Parag, for clarifying the process. It's actually a fair point to see the importance of internal dynamics in the country, not just seeing Yemen as a puppet state at the hands of regional powers from the very beginning. Thank you. I want to move on with Professor Lucas regarding Iran's involvement in Syria. So defenders of the Assad regime like to point to the presence of militant groups as a justification to crush the initially peaceful pro-democracy uprisings in Syria. However, even during the early days of the revolution, Iran and its proxies, like Lebanon's Hezbollah, began to demonize the protesters, possibly encouraging the Assad regime to escalate its brutal crackdown on pro-reform demonstrations. In your view, what was the impact of the initial Iranian role, which includes that of Hezbollah, obviously, even before Iran's public and direct armed involvement in Syria?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, Baraz's great answer on Yemen gives me a link in terms of how to approach it. And that is, from my perspective, whether we're talking about Yemen, Syria, perhaps later we'll talk about Iraq and Lebanon, you start off with the local, and you start off with what is happening politically, socially, and economically. And when you have instability and conflict, outside powers will try to influence the situation. They'll try to, quote, defend themselves in the situation, or they'll try to exploit it, or possibly all of the above. And I think it's really important in Syria to start from 2011 at the outset of the protest and realize that it wasn't a case of all-out intervention by Iran or simply standing to the side. First of all, the fundamental in 2011 is that the mass protest against the Assad regime are not instigated by the US, they're not instigated by Europe, they're not part of a plot for regime change. The US actually was very hesitant about moving against Assad and did not draw red lines until the summer of 2011. But as those protests grow, as you have millions of people inside Syria, and they're calling for rights and reforms, Assad has got two major external allies who are advising different things. Now, the Russians, and I'll get to Iran, but the Russians are interesting because they're using the model of Chechnya, where they had crushed a protest movement. And I have it on good authority, in other words, someone who was there, that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, went and met with Assad. And he effectively said, all right, how many lives do you need to take to be able to restore stability? And Lavrov said 50,000. And Assad said 100,000. And Lavrov said, okay. Now, the Iranian approach in 2011 was much different. They actually were calling on Assad, look, you need to give some semblance of calling for reforms here. You need to give some semblance of actually acknowledging what you hear from the protesters. And there's sort of a half-hearted speech by Assad in May 2011 that you might remember. But what happens is, of course, the Assad regime isn't going to really negotiate with the protest. Instead, by early 2012, they're trying to bomb the protest out of existence. Remember what happened in Homs, the devastation of that city. At the same time, other powers are saying, look, I'm in on the side of the opposition, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait. And so the Iranians have a fundamental choice. And I think the key point, if I would encourage people to really look at this in detail, is September 2012. Assad's military is on the ropes. A lot of his soldiers have defected. A lot of his troops are really not fit for purpose. And the Iranians moved from supporting him with intelligence and political advice and billions of dollars in lines of credit to the military support. When the Revolutionary Guards say, through the Quds Force, we will mobilize, we will organize, mobilize, and command a Syrian defense force, the National Defense Forces of 50,000 units, effectively pro-Assad militias. That is the marker of when Iran goes from trying to, as it were, politically navigate this to we're going to back Assad with military force. And then, of course, Hezbollah follows, where by 2013, for example, in the battle for Qusair near Lebanon, that's one of the turning points of the conflict. Hezbollah is really responsible for pushing the opposition back. And you just take it from there that by 2015, well, just one more story, because I don't want to go on too long. The head of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, goes to Moscow. Once again, Assad's in trouble. He's lost the northwest of the country. He's lost the south of the country. Soleimani goes to the Russians, says, what do we do? He and Vladimir Putin, or Putin's officials, agree, a massive military intervention, all out, air, ground, supported by propaganda, and even, of course, accepting the fact that Assad's going to use chemical weapons. So the Iranian intervention in Syria proceeds in stages, from being an idea of trying to contain the conflict to effectively making the decision, for better, for worse, we've got to go all in behind Assad.
So thank you so much, Professor Lucas. So it was nice to remember all process. And we will talk about Russia's interference a bit later.
Sure.
So I want to move with Talha Abdulrazak. Talha, Iraq is another country suffering from Iran's interference. And Iran, its proxies in Iraq, were repeatedly involved in the quashing of protests, particularly those involving the Iraqi Sunni community. By engaging in sectarian politics, pro-Iran politicians like former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki managed to largely avoid criticism from the Shia community whenever the government or militias committed atrocities against Sunnis. But later on, these militias began to kill Shia protesters as well. Has this led to some sort of healing of Sunni Shia civil war wounds in Iraq, or was the damage too deep to repair?
I think there are two branches to the answer that I'll give to this one. So I don't think that the rifts have healed per se. And that's because the extent of the harm suffered by the Sunni Arab population in particular, and let's not forget that the majority of the Kurds in Iraq are also Sunnis. The Sunni Arab population in particular has suffered so greatly ever since, to be honest, it's even before 2003. Like, everyone kind of likes to paint this picture that pre-invasion Iraq was kind of this utopia for Sunni Arabs. That's not the case. I myself am a Sunni Arab. I grew up in the West for a very particular reason. The regime was not friendly towards any kind of political dissent, even that coming from Sunni Arabs. And equally, and it's important to state that it was not an overtly, massively sectarian regime either. The key differentiator between what Saddam Hussein liked or disliked was, were you committed to him? That's ultimately what mattered. Did you support his, did you support his throne, his regime? Are you on his side? Are you willing to play ball with the Baathists? If so, welcome, marhaban. If not, you're either going to be persecuted, tortured, you name it. So moving on to the kind of the post-2003 phase, and one of the kind of the most dastardly things that the US administration did, particularly under military governor Paul Bremer, was to instigate what was known as a de-Baathification process. And ostensibly what that was, it was to basically kind of like how, kind of post-World War II Germany, the denazification process, trying to get Nazis out of the kind of the major organs of the state, security forces, and so on. This was a similar process, except for it wasn't necessarily geared towards Baathists, because the Iraqi government, subsequent Iraqi government, and the US occupation forces decided that there were some Baathists that they could more than live with, that they could kind of exonerate and rehabilitate and place them into the system. But it was primarily aimed at Sunni Arab political participation. So, for example, and I'm not sure if he's still in Turkey, but he spent some time there anyway. The former Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi was a Sunni politician. Anytime they wanted to get rid of a Sunni, there was one of two charges. You were either a Ba'athist, or you were Al-Qaeda or some kind of terrorist, and you were responsible for organizing terrorist attacks. Now, obviously, that's a grave allegation to kind of levy, especially when it comes to senior politicians, like al-Hashimi was. But such was the environment that you could easily, and if a Sunni was deemed to be kind of not playing ball, and bearing in mind, Hashimi was playing ball, he wanted the political process to succeed. I remember when he came to London encouraging diaspora Iraqis to vote. He had very much bought into the post-2003 order. But even someone like him, who would occasionally highlight atrocities or abuses, human rights violations, even he was deemed to be distasteful. So what happened was, you had a series of not only Sunni politicians, but also Sunnis on the street, because let's not forget, in around about 2006, particularly with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and the bombing attacks against Shi'i shrines, that was used as a catalyst to not only attack the political class, but also to go after Sunnis writ large. So, for example, it was not uncommon for people bearing the name Omar, Abu Bakr, even my name, Talha, names that are deemed to be Sunni. You could be stopped at a checkpoint by security forces and you'd be dismounted from your car, they'll check your ID papers and shoot you dead on the spot. It was as simple as that. And this is in large part, lots of people say, oh, these are kind of like non-state actors, militias. In large part, these militias had infiltrated Iraqi security institutions, particularly the Interior Ministry, which is basically run by the Badr organization, which is very, very closely linked to Iran. So, without going through the entire history of that, every protest movement that was kind of Sunni dominated, what the government would do to kind of discourage a more broader, kind of a broad church, shall we say, of Iraqi participants in demonstration movements to call for accountability, transparency, and more democracy, and so on. What they would do is they'd simply play a game of divide and conquer. So they'd say to their Shi'i heartland, the main constituents, oh, don't go out and support these Sunnis because they're in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. And then that would justify a crackdown. And you'll find that a lot of the Shi'i demonstrators that are out protesting today, at the time, there was not many Shi'i voices. There were a few notable ones. Like, for example, there was Ayatollah Sarhi, who was an Arab Shi'i cleric, a senior one. He was very firmly against former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and his cronies. And what happened to him, actually, interestingly enough, was during the last major protest movement that the Sunnis organized, which was ultimately hijacked by Daesh. In 2003, also around about then, I can't remember the exact date, but they actually sent helicopter gunships to his headquarters and just let rip. They didn't kill him, but it was to send a clear message. And he was forced underground. He's basically not been heard from since. So even Shia, even the Shia who wanted to kind of hold their government to account back then, they were more or less treated as Sunnis. And that's something that kind of features later on. So now what we're looking at, after Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated and then morphed into Daesh, it went across the border into Syria, regained some kind of power, came back over the border into Iraq, and started its well-known campaign between 2014, which ended disastrously for them in 2017. Once those excuses of, okay, the Ba'athists have now been defeated, they're gone. The Al-Qaeda has been defeated, they're gone. Daesh has been defeated. They're not exactly gone. They're still in the area. They're still roaming around causing attacks, but they're not the existential threat that they were. So the government could no longer say to the Shi'i public, well, look, if you don't support us, then it's going to lead to the downfall of the state. The Sunnis are going to come back. They're going to come back with the Ba'athists. They're going to come back with Al-Qaeda. They're going to come back with whoever. All these excuses just melted away. And that's why we had the protest movement forming in 2019. But that's only fresh. That's very fresh. It's very new. The Sunnis are now looking at this and thinking, and I've heard this, from people I've interviewed. They've said, well, we would actually love to come out and support them in the streets, but there's a few things stopping us. One, where the hell were they when we were getting shot and tortured and killed for us to come out for them now? And again, the second thing is, since the war against Daesh, our cities have been almost entirely destroyed. Our cities are still rubble today. If we come out and demonstrate, then they're just going to come back and kill us again, and what's left will be taken away. So these kind of, the sheer destruction faced by the Sunni Arab community has led to that sentiment whereby they don't want to necessarily engage, partly because they've been cowed into silence, and also partly because they feel that they were betrayed by their fellow countrymen.
Thank you so much, Talha. So it was actually good to mention the Ba'athification process because it was one of the fundamental problems in Iraq even today. So speaking of atrocities and brutalism that took place in the region, I want to ask you, Bara, We frequently hear about the atrocities the Saudi-led coalition is committing in Yemen, and sometimes we hear about the Houthi militia acting as an Iranian proxy when they attack Riyadh. However, there has been a little focus on what the Iran-backed group is doing to other Yemenis, whether in Sana'a, which they control, or other Yemeni regions outside their control like Taiz. Could you shed light on how the Iran-backed Houthis are treating other Yemenis?
Yeah, sure. And I think this question comes to the core of the Yemeni conflict, because you rarely hear about what is happening to the other Yemeni groups who are still inside the country, or the other towns and villages that have been either under siege or left in total destruction. So the real like if I follow a sequence of events, we at the beginning failed to see, as when we were, and I'm referring to myself as one of the protesters in 2011, failed to see what was happening to the people of Sada, the people from the north of the country, from the north of Yemen, where the Houthis originally came from. So the majority of the Houthis today come from that region, but we failed to see what have happened to the people in Sada, what have happened to them. And many of the tribal leaders, and Yemen is a very tribal country. Many of the tribal leaders who had resisted or even voiced an opinion against the Houthis, or have objected to the idea that the Houthis can take over an entire province or village or town, were firstly witnessed that them and their families had to be forced to leave their towns if they wanted to still be alive, and then their properties were destroyed. And you could see the Houthis posting those videos online while they are destroying and demolishing the properties of their opponents. All of that while chanting their slogan, "Death to America, death to Israel, damn on the Jews, and victory to Islam." And then it moved on to other neighboring provinces. Only when it started to hit very close to the capital, to Sana'a, that's when people kind of had a wake up, like, oh, we failed to see this for quite a long time. This is not just the people who had been simply have some regional grievances, or just are trying to voice their opposition to the state. They're actually committing atrocities on a daily, if not weekly, if not daily basis. And then we have the town of Taiz. This is the most populated city in Yemen. It hosts 3 million people. It has been under siege for, believe it or not, for the last 6 years. For the last 6 years, it has been under total siege. The price of food there is very expensive because people have to smuggle in food, and they have to smuggle in even drinking water. It reached to a very desperate situation that the people inside hospitals couldn't find oxygen canisters just to treat the injured. I still remember the image of literally born babies who couldn't find oxygen for the incumbents, for them to just to breathe the very first moments when they are when they're brought to life. And that's an ongoing systematic policy by the Houthis, but it has an aim. They want to do something. First of all, it's want to send a message to the other opponents and to the other towns and villages. This is what will happen if you try to oppose us, or if you try to resist our takeover. And second, and that's very important, is trying to say the international community will not come to your rescue. See what happened to Taiz. It's the mostly populated areas. It has gained some coverage by some UN reports, but the international community will not come to your rescue. And that message, although it is not being said out loud to international audience, but it's said very clearly to the Yemenis inside. People hear that on a daily basis. Now the situation also inside Sana'a is very dire, that the families sometimes have no choice. So I have personally interviewed 2 families who had told me very clearly that they had no option but to send their children to what they call the cultural courses, and that's just one step before being joined into a training camp to go and fight, because that's the only paid income that they can get. And that's another thing that people don't understand. The public sector and all of the areas that the Houthis have control do not get paid. The only way for you to get paid is to send your family member. You have to have a family member who have joined the Houthis to fight. Other than that, you're not going to get paid. You're not going to have a monthly income or a monthly salary. And the Houthis have infiltrated all the state institutions. You will not be able to survive within that structure if you do not show commitment to the movement and show it by evidence. And that's by sending your family member or your own children to join the either the training courses or the battlefronts. Now, yes, the Houthis do not control the whole of Yemen, but they control heavily and densely populated areas. Those populated areas are very poor and are in a very dire humanitarian situation. People are left with no options, with few options to what they can do with their lives. Can they continue and resist the Houthis? If you resist the Houthis, I know my own neighbor who joined as a journalist for an intern for a magazine, got picked up in October 2014, and is still missing until today. His family haven't heard anything from him. To another friend who actually was with us in one of the protests against the Houthis, they abducted him from the protest, and then he was tortured in the same day. At night, called us and say, "Go pick up the corpse of your own friend." And that's, again, it's signaling a message to that democracy movement that you cannot repeat what you did in 2011 to us, and then signaling another thing to the tribal community in Yemen, that the whole community will be punished if it poses a form, even if just pointing out or voicing out opposition or an opinion against the Houthis. And the failure above all of that is the response of the international community, because if you do not have an international community also who's aware about the details about what's happening inside Yemen, then you see a response that is very weak, which means basically they can take the cover of, yes, there is a Saudi-led coalition as a cover-up for all of those atrocities and violations committed in beneath.
Thank you, Bara. Thank you. Thank you for emphasizing the role of international community, but unfortunately, it's not enough to help Yemeni people. It's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and our prayers with the Yemeni people. So I want to continue with a similar topic, actually. Professor Lucas, Iran's backing of sectarian militias, whether made up of Syrians, Iraqis, or Afghans on the ground in Syria, combined with the Russian air support, as you mentioned, as well as the presence of radical or separatist terror groups, eventually crushed what was left of Syrian democratic aspirations. In addition, Iran's sowing of sectarian seeds has led to demographic changes in Syria, with millions of Syrians being displaced or becoming refugees. To what degree does Iran share responsibility for the violent direction the Syrian crisis took?
It would be interesting if you put that question to an Iranian official as to how much responsibility they take. I might have a bit of a different perspective, but I'll start with something which is a bit unusual, because it'd be interesting to hear Taha and Bara's response to this. I don't necessarily think when the Iranians go in, they think in a sectarian way when they provide support. I mean, it is the case, for example, in Iraq, that they work with mainly Shia groups because of the nature of the conflict in that country. In Yemen, it's with 12er Shia. You know, this particular type of Shia with the Houthis, But in Syria, it's with Alawi. The Assad is an Alawite, right? And so it is cast as sectarian because of local conditions, and I understand that. But Iran is simply trying to influence or to maintain a particular position of power, and in that position of power, civilians are expendable. That's the main thing to say. And as I said, Iran faced a fundamental choice in 2012, which is, look, you've got millions of Syrians who've come out against Assad. You've got a regime which is not sustainable on its own. Its military is broken. Economically, it depends on you for oil and for lines of credit. Politically, it's isolated. Almost no one else is recognizing it. Will you work with Syrians to try to come up with a new country? But Iran looked at the other side of that and said, well, if we work with those other Syrians, they might not guarantee us the so-called land bridge to Hezbollah, Shia faction in Lebanon. It might weaken our position vis-a-vis other countries such as Iraq because we look weaker in terms of influence. Therefore, we'll beat our chest. Because let me add one other thing that I think a lot of people have forgotten, at least I don't see it in Western media. When we had all these movements in Yemen, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Tunisia in 2011, Iran put its chips on what it called an Islamic Awakening. I don't know if y'all recall that. And the supreme leader kept saying, an Islamic Awakening, and it begins in Egypt. But the problem for Iran is they miscalculated. The Egyptian revolutionary movement, including the Muslim Brotherhood that came into power, didn't want an Iran-led Islamic Awakening. And so Iran had to reconsider its whole approach, not just to Syria, but across the Arab world, North Africa and the Middle East, in the aftermath of that. Now, what are the consequences of it? Look, as I said at the start, Iran called for reform. They didn't call for mass killings. But once the Assad regime engages on mass killings, when they move from massacres on the ground to sustained bombing, when they move to tens of thousands of barrel bombs, when they move to chemical weapons, where do you draw the line with the Assad regime? And Iran never drew the line. Instead, what it did, and this is important because, again, the Iran relationship with Russia in 2015 is we're going to shift the terms of this and make everybody ignore those killings of hundreds of thousands of civilians. We'll call something a political process. Let's call it the Astana Process. And let's bring Turkey into it, something I'm happy to discuss. And the Astana Process is therefore the cloak. It's the political fig leaf for the killings to continue on the ground.
Thank you, Professor Lucas. So you mentioned Islamic Awakening at the beginning of Arab Spring. Talha, when it comes to Iran, we know another concept, the Iran-led axis of resistance, presents itself as the protector of the people of the region from imperialism and Zionism. But history, of course, has shown that the Iranian regime is willing to make deals with the US or Israel when it suits its interests. How does Tehran square that circle, especially when almost all of Iran's victims are the people of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen? Why are anti-regime protesters in Bahrain heroes, but pro-democracy demonstrators in Syria villains, according to the Iranian regime's worldview? And I know Professor Lucas answered this question for some part, but I want to hear your view as well.
Oh yeah, he kind of jumped the gun on me there.
Sorry,
well,
I apologize.
No, it's fine. It's good. It's an excellent question, and hopefully I can, my answer will segue nicely into what Professor Lucas was saying. I actually agree. I mean, I do write a lot about sectarianism and the kind of malign and malignant influence that Iran has on these Shia militia groups. But I do believe that Iran is a very, very pragmatic player. It weaponizes its Shia identity for sure, because that's one lever it can pull. But we have to bear in mind that in the 1980s, after the revolution, Khomeini's revolution in 1979, and then when the war in Iraq happened, the Iran-Iraq war, its appeals to the Shia Arabs of Iraq were not heeded, at the level that it expected. Of course, you have groups like Badr who, have been rewarded for their decades-long loyalty now, and they have the interior ministry and everything else. These guys were committed kind of Shi'i Islamists. and they were committed to the specific brand of Shia Islamism, which is the Khomeini kind of brand of politics. But on the whole, if we look at the kind of the foot soldiers who did the majority of the fighting on the Iraqi side, a very, very large proportion of them were Shi'i Arabs. And, that kind of often gets, downplayed, or people like to have an overly simplistic view of the way that these nation states behave. And they look at kind of the non-state actors, and they look at their rhetoric, and then they kind of reverse it on to the kind of reflect it back onto their patrons, which is in this case the Iranians. But the Iranians are extremely pragmatic. Like they have alliances, for example, with Sunni groups in Iraq. For example, the Speaker of Parliament, Halbousi, has very strong connections to Iran. Another kind of thing is, I don't want to kind of overblow them and say that they are senior Sunni politicians, because no one really bothered to vote. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that the Sunni political voices that are there on the theater these days, they all have close ties to Iran, without fail. So it's not, sectarian does exist for sure. Iran weaponizes its Shia identity. It will kind of frequently draw upon the imagery of Hussein bin Ali, Imam Hussein bin Ali radiallahu anhu, and other kind of Islamic figures and what they deem to be saints. And I don't want to say, for example, that Hussein is specifically a Shi'i figure. He's not. He's revered among Sunnis as well. But the kind of the imagery that's used of the martyrdom, the sacrifice, standing up against oppression, injustice, and so on, that's replicated across all of the groups that Iran backs, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Badr to the Sadrists as well. The so-called anti-Iran guys, they all use the same symbolism and imagery. But it's structural. You've got the Shiism aspect. You've also got certain aspects of Persian nationalism, by the way. And at some point, maybe we'll discuss this in terms of how ethnic and religious minorities are treated within Iran. So, for example, the Ahwazi Arabs, who live in southwestern Iran, they are predominantly Shia, but they are persecuted. Their water rights are infringed upon. They're executed for any kind of political dissent. Their cultural rights, in terms of speaking Arabic, are stamped out. So there's a kind of a myriad, a constellation of abuses that they face. Not to mention the Baluchis, for example, in the southeast, and the Azeri Turks, and so on. So I don't think it's fair to just always say that Iran is just a Shi'i power. It is, for sure, but it's very pragmatic. It's willing to cut deals with anyone, and that includes the great Satan, the United States. That includes Israel. So, for example, there was a high level of intelligence cooperation between Iran and Israel during the Iran-Iraq war. There's a famous military operation called Operation Opera, which the Israelis used F-16s to take out the nascent Iraqi nuclear research reactor. That was preceded by a strike, an airstrike conducted by the Iranians. So because their attempt failed, the feedback that they got back from that operation, the intelligence that they got and everything else, they actually fed back to Israel. And, bearing in mind Khomeini's rhetoric, what he's actually saying to the people, the road to Jerusalem goes through Karbala. So we have to defeat the Iraqi enemy, and then we're going to go and liberate Jerusalem. But in the meantime, let's have a chat with Tel Aviv. Let's coordinate with them, because destroying the Iraqi state and taking over Karbala is more important. So they're not very ideologically committed to just having this very strict Shi'i interpretation of their politics. It flows across an entire spectrum between religion, between realpolitik, and social influence. And that's the way it kind of extends its power. So that's why, in answer to your question, I kind of went a long-winded way around it, but that's why, for example, revolutionary groups in Bahrain were seen as the good guys. Why? Because they were putting up posters of, not all of them, of course, but some of them were coming onto the streets around what was formerly known as the Pearl Roundabout, and I think they've renamed it since. And they were carrying placards of Khamenei and other kind of senior Iranian clergymen and politicians. So these guys were kind of expressing a level of deference to Iran, if not loyalty. And the Iranians obviously want to expand their influence. Fundamentally, that's what they want to do. They want to have a hegemonic role in the Middle East. How they achieve that is open to interpretation, whether it's done through Shi'i fundamentalism or whether it's done through cutting deals with tribes or even great powers like the United States and Israel. They don't really care.
Yeah, thank you, Talha. I think Iran is one of the most successful countries to play for both sides with its generous face, Katako. Talha emphasized.
Turkey could learn a lot from that.
True.
Talha emphasized the pragmatic side of Iran with all symbolic concepts as well, like martyrdom, for example. Bara, what I'm going to ask to you might sound more idealistic, but I want to hear your opinion as well. The regional backers of the warring sides in Yemen, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, are not known for their democracy promotions in the region, obviously. What do you see as the way forward, not just with regards to the war, but also to returning to the democratic process that was underway post 2011? As a former member Yemeni National Dialogue, can you ever trust the Houthis? How much influence does Iran actually have over the Houthis? And is there a chance that the Houthis will put the interest of all of Yemenis ahead of its partnership with Iran? And I know you mentioned all atrocities by Houthis, but I want to hear this.
Well, first of all, if you'd allow me to jump quickly back into the point that both Scott and also Talha mentioned, but Scott mentioned the what they called the Islamic Awakening, and interestingly, for someone who joined the protests in 2011. In 2012, what happened was this is the period where I would say the political elite structure in Yemen were focused inside Yemen, while others were quite active, actively working towards something that is coming. So in 2012, many of the youth who were not happy with the outcomes of the Gulf Initiative, which is the agreements between the former regime and the opposition parties. This is where the Houthis came in. They started to appeal to that group who are frustrated, young people who are not happy with the agreements, with the deal, and saying, well, you know, the Saudis backstabbed you like usual, the Americans backstabbed you, the international community backstabbed you, you can't trust any of them. So they invited youth groups to travel to both Lebanon and to Tehran to attend conferences. And the first conference I still remember, it's called the Islamic Awakening. So they refer to the all revolutions as the Islamic Awakening. And now, how do I know that? Because I was invited. Now, I didn't go, but many of my colleagues attended the conference. I felt it was a little bit more, as you can imagine, a little bit more suspicious to go to Iran to attend a conference called the Islamic Awakening. But the most important is what happens after that. Then in that period, the actual aim of those conferences, there was a vetting process of whom do they think they will recruit to join the movement for the coming period. And this is where I think where the political Yemeni elite's infrastructure was focused on the national dialogue, the transitional justice and reconciliation, talking about the referendum, the elections, while the Houthis were actively working for something coming. They're trying, we have to prepare for when we're not satisfied with this agreement. How can we seize the moment? Because definitely with any agreement, when it comes after a revolution, you will have many people who are not satisfied with the agreement. There are people, even in referendums, after a referendum, who will not be happy with the referendum. There will always be that group who will feel they've been pushed or they've been they've been marginalized. So they tried, how can we invest on this? How can we bank on those frustrated youth and groups to actually work with us? The groups who then joined them were used to meet with Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon. And then later on, they formed something called the Political Council, the Houthi Political Council, which still exists in Sana'a until today. Now, the person who was meeting them, and that we only discovered that late in 2020, was the guy who's now named as Iran's ambassador to Sana'a, Hassan Irlo. They used to refer to him back then as Abu Hadi. They didn't have, he used an alias. He wouldn't use his actual name. But Abu Hassan Irlu, who's now Iran's ambassador to the Houthis, is an Iranian Revolutionary Guard officer who fought in the Iran-Iraq war, and that's why he's strategic. He's important to all of this, what's happening in Yemen, and he was tasked to oversee the whole Yemen file. When they started testing the waters, how can we, if we started sending weaponry to the Houthis and let's see the outcome, they saw two things that were happening. First of all, the former regime was willing to work with them because he didn't want to be pushed. The former president didn't want to be pushed out of power, so he thought, why not? Let's work for the Houthis temporarily until I push the new government aside. And then they saw that the Houthis were willing to militarize the movement. They were willing to push that military aspect of the movement forward. Now, coming back to what both of them said, yes, the Houthis do not share the same. They're not from the same sects. They're not. The Houthis are not Shia 12ers, for example. But there is Zaidi. This is a different sect. Yeah. It's much closer to Sunni. But there is something more important that they share, which is they share the political ideology. They believe that it is essential to disrupt the national order, which they think is a U.S.-led regional order. A U.S.-led regional order that is pinned on the stability of both Saudi Arabia and Israel. So if they have something that is going to start pushing Saudi Arabia or destabilizing, hopefully, Saudi Arabia in the future, then that's something worth investing in, even if the investment will start with something small, like sending shipments of weapons and then test the waters. Let's see what's going to happen. But they started then gaining a lot of influence in return. So, answering your question, in order for a national reconciliation to happen, which I think is the only way forward. There has to be a reconciliation first, and then hopefully it's going to be a transitional justice process, and then moving to elections. There needs to be an addressing of that aspect. You cannot have an armed group that similar to Hezbollah, for example, able to destabilize the electoral process, able to dissolve the government, able to launch a coup whenever it sees fit, to disrupt any process. Because if that happens, then this is basically it's a prescription to chaos. Every time you're going to have some form of stability, some form of agreement, and then you're going to have elections. If they're not satisfied with the results, they're going to launch a coup, and then we're back to square one. And I think that's the more challenging aspect is, will the Yemenis be able to address the challenge of having non-state actors working? Because that's what it comes to it. The Houthis want to be part of the political scene, but also at the same time they say, but our military wing is going to stay as it is, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, where our military wing is going to remain as it is, but we're going to participate in the political in the political scene. And I think that's quite the challenge. The more scary thought for me is when I see diplomats and I see international actors trying to entertain this idea. They say, well, yeah, why not? Let's give them a chance. You guys should work with them. Try to co-op and deal with the fact that you're going to have a non-state actor, an armed group that is present, and then try to work with the system. Although, given the fact that it didn't work in Lebanon, and Lebanon is heading towards chaos, why do we want to repeat the same thing in Yemen?
Yeah, thank you. I know my question was idealistic, but you showed again the pragmatic side as well, the reality. Professor Lucas, from the very beginning, as you mentioned earlier as well, Iran was on the ground in Syria, and Tehran has been harshly criticized by its own people for spending money outside of the country. Another important player, Russia, was actually a latecomer, I mean, with the direct military involvement. So for today, how much influence does Iran have in Syria? Was the financial cost of war worth it for Iran? How does it view Russia's role in Syria, given Moscow's accommodation of both Iranian and Israeli interests?
Yeah, I think to give you a background to this, very early in the conflict, after 2011, the former president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, came out and effectively voiced what a lot of people were saying on the street in Iran, which is, why are we doing this? Why are we propping up Assad? Why are we expending all this resource with someone who is killing his people? But it was interesting that the reaction was that was a line too far. And the regime shut down Rafsanjani. They prevented him from running for president in 2013, even though they miscalculated and one of his proteges, Mr. Rouhani, became president. They then, of course, put pressure on his family, threatened to send them to prison, his sons, his daughters. And of course, he died in what some would say was suspicious circumstances soon after that. The reason why I say that is, and this, again, I'd like to put this to Taha and Barak, because I find it as an interesting contrast. People in the West will talk about Iran expanding its regional power. Iran has largely been on the defensive in Syria. And that's because rather than challenging the so-called establishment, for example, challenging the government in Yemen, or challenging, for example, in Iraq, Sunni groups that had power, here it's defending the Assad regime. It's defending the establishment. And we're talking about several billion, possibly tens of billions of dollars that they pour into this while getting very little economic reward back. We're talking about expending a lot of lives. They do put their own people in there, as well as the Afghan, the Iraqi, Pakistani militia. And of course, they put their political capital behind Assad. But here's the key thing. Assad is like, I don't know if you have this analogy. It's like the albatross around your neck, right? It's like the dead bird around your neck that will always weigh you down, because Assad will never have legitimacy with many people within Syria. Assad's system will never have legitimacy. And you are stuck defending Assad, putting in all these military commanders while the Israelis bomb you and continue to bomb you. But here's the other reason why Iran's on the defensive. They aren't even the prime backer of Assad now. The Russians are, to get to your answer. When the Russians came in 2015, and it's quite right to look at them and Iran making this deal to save Assad, but it's not a relationship of equals. When the Russians take over that bombing campaign, when they take over the sieges that are so critical to reoccupying Aleppo, reoccupying the Damascus suburbs, all the way through reoccupying the southern part of Syria in 2018, the Iranians are almost, in a sense, providing the cannon fodder for the Russians. So look at the companies who are getting most of the money out of Syria now. They're not Iranian companies. They're Russian companies that have gone in. But what do the Iranians do now? Do they actually walk away from Assad and walk away from Russia? If they do, they've lost everything in Syria off this gamble. So here is the interesting twist. What's the Iranian hope now? In recent weeks, the Iranian hope, at least for members of the regime, is that Egypt, the UAE, eventually Saudi Arabia, will save them, in a sense, by recognizing Assad again. That if Syria can get back into the Arab League and get some type of legitimacy, Iran will have some kind of position where it's not supporting this guy who's isolated. So in a strange sense, all these conflicts that have come up between Iran and the Gulf states have rebounded back, where Iran, in some senses, is dependent on Israel not to go after Assad too much and dependent on the Gulf states to try to recognize him. Oh, and they also would like the Turks to recognize Assad as well, but I don't think that's going to happen in the near future.
Thank you, Professor Lucas. I will come to the role of the UAE because it's really important. But before coming to that, Talha, regarding the other actors on the ground, Iran and its proxies frequently point to the presence of extremists and terror groups in the region, a bit to contrast Tehran's action from that of its foes. But how different are the actions of some of the militias that Iran backs in neighboring countries? Also, what can you tell us about Iran's relationship with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, if we're looking at the Shia militias and just contrasting how they behave versus Daesh, for example, Daesh is obviously a much more sensational organization. What I mean by that is their actions are massively amplified in the global media. There's a number of different reasons for that. One of them is that, especially after the US-led campaign began, Daesh started to also encourage attacks against the West. The Shia organizations, barring Hezbollah in Yemen and a few other actors, generally they don't mess outside of their neighborhood. You'll find, for example, smuggling operations, especially with the drug trade. Hezbollah and IRGC-backed groups. They have a large kind of drug enterprise which actually goes all the way into North America. And I think there was a report by Politico at the time implicating the Obama regime. Ooh, shouldn't have said that. But implicating the Obama administration, saying that they turned a blind eye to the illicit drug trade in order to facilitate the 2015 nuclear deal, which is now, on life support, more or less. So when we're looking at groups operating, just say, within Iraq, quite often the atrocities that they perpetrate are on an order of magnitude the same, if not worse, than Daesh. But the thing is, when we're looking at international coverage of these atrocities, it doesn't get the same kind of reaction or response. What Daesh also did was to brag about what it was doing. So that's another difference between them. The Shia militias don't really brag about it. It's done internally, as in like, oh, you Sunni villages over there, did you see what we did to X place? We're going to do that to you. Very similar, funnily enough, to how the Haganah operated in 1948 with the expulsion of Palestinians by creating such fear and terror that it broke all resistance and they left. So it's a kind of strange twist of irony and fate that they adopted similar tactics of terror. But ISIS or Daesh would actually televise what they were doing. So they would, the Jordanian pilot, for example, that they set alight, the kind of executions that they kind of do with this, highly savvy media organization that they had going on. Whereas the Shia militias wouldn't. However, we've got many instances, such as, for example, in the village of, town of Jurf al-Sakhar, which is predominantly inhabited by the Janabi tribe and largely Sunni. Now, at the start of the war against Daesh, when the Shia militias, backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, came in, they depopulated that town. It's a war crime. There's no two ways about it. It's a war crime. They cleansed the town on the basis of their sectarian identity, and it's now, to this day, repopulated by Shia militias and militiamen and their families. So they've completely changed the demographic of the area. And this is just one example. There's many places around Samarra, for example, in areas close to the Iranian border, where they've tried to create kind of homogenous Shia zones. And that's in order to facilitate that so-called land bridge, the Shia crescent between linking Iran, going all the way through Iraq into Syria, Lebanon, and so on. So another example, when in the operations to retake Fallujah, also 643 Sunni Arab men and boys, children, just disappeared off the face of the earth, just like that. And no one kind of knew what was going on. There's been reports that a mass grave has been found with exactly 643 bodies of men and children in there. The Human Rights Watch released a report on it at the time, calling on the Iraqi government to explain what happened, and bearing in mind that the Shia militias that did this, the Popular Mobilization Forces, have since been declared a formal branch of the Iraqi armed forces. So this isn't just a crime by a non-state actor. This is a crime perpetrated by an organ of the state, knowing full well what they were doing, and there's been zero accountability. So despite the fact that the Prime Minister is technically the commander-in-chief of the Popular Mobilization Forces, in reality, they take instructions directly from the Quds Force. And you see them operating in Syria. They're there. And you have, at the time, I remember, former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi actually issued an order, and this was televised. No Iraqi forces are to be on Syrian territory whatsoever. And that is still a standing order, by the way. So it's actually gone from that administration onto this one with Kadhimi and before him with the, I've forgotten his name now, he's a short-lived prime minister. But that was a standing order. And yet they're there. They're in the border areas. Whenever America and Iran tussle over something, especially like recently, even with Biden, I know Trump gets a lot of stick for this, but even the Biden administration, when they wanted to retaliate against Iran, what do? They went and bombed the PMF and Kataib Hezbollah and these other forces who are directly connected to the organs of the state in Syria. Mm-hmm. And as I said, these guys have committed atrocities on a par with or that exceed Daesh. But it doesn't get the same kind of media attention because in large part, I believe that there's an aspect to this whereby the modern Iraqi state is largely an American construct. Yes, the Iranians have subverted it and have twisted it to their own ends. And they did strategically speaking, not morally, they did a highly, an excellent job at doing that. What they did to kind of subvert the Iraqi state and all its apparatuses to then control it and make it it's the crown jewel in the modern neo-Iranian empire is Iraq. That's the linchpin for Syria, for Lebanon, and even beyond. Even the Houthi rebels and there's been a lot of interaction between them and Iraqi forces, drone technology being exchanged. There are layers to this, but they did an excellent job at subverting the Americans and gaining control. But the modern Iraqi state, there's still this hope in the United States. There's still this hope in London and all these Western capitals that, Iraq could be that democracy, the one that we tried to install and utterly failed at. That could be the one, but we just need to support the right guys. But whoever they support fundamentally turns against them or fails or gets killed. Because, and I've said this before elsewhere, America is not a proximate power. Iran is. Iran lives in the neighborhood. Its influence will far outlast the United States because the United States, as we've seen in Afghanistan, once it gets bored of a project, when I say bored as in it lost, it will withdraw. It has no further option. And, the Trump administration was like, why are we constantly getting involved in these, endless wars? Why are we, expending all this blood and treasure? Yeah. What do I care? And Trump was very famous. One reason why a lot of people in the Arab world like him, and I say like advisedly, is because he's so open and in your face. He said that, in Iraq, we should have just come in there, just take the oil, bye, see you later, and that's it. Why are we interested in all of this kind of state building and democracy and whatever else? And what he's actually saying is something that does exist in the minds of more, shall we say, cultured politicians, who are able to express themselves a bit better, like the Obama administration and so on. They talk a good talk when it comes to democracy and human rights and whatever, but their track record says otherwise. They back all of these groups. Like America, the great Satan, provided air support to IRGC-backed groups in Iraq to fight Daesh. So just like you were saying earlier about how do you square that circle? You can't. When you think about it intellectually, it makes no sense at all. But when you think about it, so devoid of morality and the kind of the ideological underpinnings of all of this, you see that it makes a lot of strategic sense because they're like, Americans don't want to put loads of boots on the ground to go and fight Daesh. but we have willing partners. At the time, it was the Peshmerga and it was the Shia militias. We'll turn a blind eye to what they do. We'll let Human Rights Watch and whatever else do their reports, and we'll ignore them. And I think that's the key aspect that we have to understand, is that the reason why ISIS or Daesh's atrocities got a lot more attention is because they threatened the very idea of that project, the failed project of the modern Iraqi state. They also threatened the idea of the kind of the modern nation state and the ideas of these borders and everything else. You know, as much as they are, you know, a death culture, we say, and as much as they are insane in a lot of the stuff that they talk about and their ideology, that's fine. We can all agree on that. But something that they said actually elicits a response in a lot of communities, particularly when it comes to nation state borders. That threat was unacceptable. And any group that comes to work against that threat will similarly be annihilated. So when you've got some local actors who misbehave, and I say that again, limiting what they've done, it's not just misbehavior, it's war crimes. They turn a blind eye to it because it serves their interests, it serves their agenda.
Thank you, Talha. Thank you for mentioning this, because this was really important. And unfortunately, most of the time, it's not possible to see these in international media. We are running out of time, but I really want to hear your opinion regarding the role of the UAE. So, Bara, there were reports that the UAE, despite its alliance with Saudi Arabia, has been adopting a less hostile position towards the Houthis, as Abu Dhabi shares with the Iran-backed groups a common enemy, namely Al-Islah, who are said to be the Muslim Brotherhood brand in Yemen. We already witnessed in increasing Emirati coziness with another Iranian proxy in the region, that is Syria's Assad regime. How do you see the future of the UAE-Iran common interest playing out, particularly in Yemen?
So when it comes to Yemen, I think that's when a lot of what people think they know about the UAE and what the Emirates' ambitions are when it comes to its relationship. This is when it comes to this is a place where everyone can witness what's been happening. So the United Arab Emirates, when it comes to the Houthis, one of the biggest strategic battles that if I put them together, the Saudi-led coalition in general have succeeded in fighting. That's in the south of Yemen, that's in some areas in central Yemen, and in the west coast of Yemen. That was mainly because of the UAE. So the UAE, when it comes to military approach, ground forces, and providing tactical supports to the Yemeni forces. When I say the Yemeni forces, the forces that are by and large, you could say, loyal to the Yemeni government, the internationally recognized government. They have been the most strategic, or the most effective, I would say, operations. So they have, in terms of effectiveness, far beyond than any. Even far more than Saudi Arabia has provided in terms of the actual fights with the Houthis. But this is where it comes. It comes with a caveat. With the UAE coming into to the conflict in the south of Yemen, it started propping up a southern secessionist movement and forming a new force. So another armed group. When we talk about the Houthis, a non-state actor, another non-state actor in the south of Yemen, and they called it the security belt. And then that security belt was mostly similarly to the Houthis. So they're the leaders are part of the political scene, but they also operate outside the parameters of the Yemeni state. So they're not part of the Yemeni Ministry of Interior. They're not part of the Yemeni law enforcement. So they do not abide by the Yemeni judiciary. In fact, their only military command is the UAE officers who are based in Aden. That's the only group of people they will respond to. And now, while that was happening, of course, they've created a set of new problems of their own. They created informal detention centers of their own. They've created security checkpoints of their own. They've created a quasi-security structure of their own. And all of this, their only line of command is the UAE officers, not even the Saudi-led coalition. So not even the coalition joint task force in Riyadh. That's only the UAE officers inside Yemen. Now moving on forward, what happened? They started then to actively go in confrontations with the Yemeni military and the Yemeni security structure, including eventually succeeding to push out the Yemeni Minister of Interior from the interim capital of Aden. They pushed him out of Aden in it was between August and September 2019. And so in fact, what then you will have, although they came in with under the same umbrella, which is we're here to support the internationally recognized government, there is a Security Council Resolution 2216, so we are under that umbrella. But then later on, when you hear their statements coming from their military leaders, their media outlets, they're saying, no, our aim is something else. We are here to fight the Muslim Brotherhood. We're here to fight the Islah Party, in addition to the Houthis. Now, the Islah Party in Yemen is quite of a different type of movement than the traditional Muslim Brotherhood. Again, coming back to Yemen, remember I said Yemen is a very tribal community. So the tribal leaders within the Islah movement historically have had ties with Saudi Arabia. So effectively, what the UAE eventually was doing was fighting Saudi allies inside Yemen, and saying, no, we're just focusing, we're fighting Islamist movements in general. We have an interest of fighting terrorist ideologies, extremist ideologies in the region, and that fact, I think it comes back to the same notion that I initially started. The idea that and I consider myself a believer of that, the modern nation state. You need to prescribe within that framework so you can move forward. Because if you do not prescribe, then what the Iranians are saying, no, we want an Islamic hegemony over the region. The idea of a modern nation state is a Western invented idea, and then it's a recipe for chaos. Now with the UAE, they're doing a similar thing, but quite on the opposite direction. We're saying we're fighting extremist movements everywhere, anywhere they exist, but that also contradicts the idea of the modern nation state. It's the responsibility of the state to fight any extremist ideologies within its border. It's the responsibility of the state to fight any terrorist activities, whether Al-Qaeda or Daesh or anyone within their border. It's not the responsibility of other states to come in, and especially regional powers to come in and do that work with you, especially when that government is saying publicly you are not coordinating with it. When it's saying publicly, you are fighting the core essence of its presence on the ground. And I think this has been more of the complication with the United Arab Emirates when it comes to presence of Yemen. Inside it was fighting the Houthis. Then it shifted, now saying, no, we're going to fight the Muslim Brotherhood, while ignoring the fact that the Islah Party is strategically have been and historically have been an ally to Saudi Arabia and have been the main benchmark when it comes to the fight against the Houthis. That's where the Saudis have relied upon the most when it comes to the fights against the Houthis. So it disrupted the local dynamics so much, and then now we have this situation where you have the UAE supporting a secessionist movement in the south of Yemen, while at the same time saying we're working within the umbrella of the 2216 Security Council resolution and under the umbrella of the Saudi-led coalition.
Thank you, Bara. Professor Lucas, Pro-Iranian figures in the region have welcomed the UAE's rapprochement with Syria's Assad regime as a better late than never move. Some anti-Tehran supporters of Abu Dhabi are seeking to present the warning of ties with Damascus as some sort of competition with Iran over influence in Syria. Does Arab rapprochement with Assad regime ultimately help or harm Iran's influence in the country?
I think you need some context here, which is, first of all, neither for the UAE for Saudi, they've never had a priority in any way assisting the Iranians or even necessarily competing with the Iranians in Syria. And secondly, neither the UAE nor Syria have ever had a priority of replacing the Assad regime with a democratic system opened out to mass participation. They simply wanted to support a group who, replacing Assad, had a stake in what might be effectively a different version of autocracy. We need to be honest about this. So to give a full answer to your question of what's happening now, I've got to walk you back a bit. And that is, there's a key moment in 2015, which affects not only Syria, but Yemen, which is that in February 2015, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia dies, and Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, he really wants to be the day-to-day ruler. His father is the nominal ruler, King Salman, but he wants to be the day-to-day ruler. But he's a young guy. He's got to show his authority. Now, he, in effect, had been mentored or was a protege of Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince of UAE. So what do? This is an influence, I think, and I'd be interested in Baraz's opinion on this, in the massive intervention, the military intervention of spring 2015. It wasn't just to defend against the Houthis. It was to stamp their authority by using Yemen as a playground. Well, we know how that's going. But when it comes to Syria, that was a key moment as well, because that's when the anti-Assad groups made their big advance up in the northwest. Now, the UAE and Saudi always supported different factions. They never supported the same factions in the northwest, but each of them think, gosh, this is our moment. This is our expansion of influence. And they miscalculated. They miscalculated internally because after a whole range of infighting, the strongest anti-Assad faction, at least in terms of arms, is the Islamist bloc Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Comes out of Jabhat al-Nusra, which owes no ties to any government, but of course comes out of links with al-Qaeda. So they don't have control over who is basically the dominant force in the northwest. And more importantly, Syria is now 3 different countries. All right, you've got the Assad regime, but who's the key influence, the key external influence in the northwest? It's Turkey. In the northeast, the key internal influence are the Kurdish groups. And who are they backed by? The US. So where is the UAE now? Where's Saudi Arabia now? So what the UAE looks at now in 2021 is, we've gambled and lost. How do we make the most of a bad bet? We start to ease toward negotiating with Damascus. Maybe we can sort of sweep away all these massive deaths that the Assad regime has caused, and we can get some economic benefit, or we can get some political leverage by getting other Arab states to work with Assad. The problem for the UAE is going to be the same problem for Iran that we talked about for Iran. When you tie yourself to Assad, you are tying yourself to damaged goods. And I don't think other Arab states are going to be quite as keen to follow the UAE as they think they might be. But here's another reason. Here's another thing that you haven't quite mentioned yet. Part of the reason why the UAE is maneuvering with Assad is because the UAE is maneuvering with Israel. And the deal is that Assad gets to stay in Damascus as long as he does not move towards the Golan Heights or allow the Iranians and Hezbollah to go towards the Golan Heights. And so the deal that you're talking about, Iran is a factor, but it's not really as a primary factor in terms of the power politics, which involves the UAE, other Arab states, and the Israelis.
Thank you so much, Professor Lucas. We couldn't talk much about Israeli, but thank you for mentioning this. Talha, my last question was about the Ahwazis, and you already mentioned, but if you would like to tell us more about their plight, the floor is yours.
So the plight of the Ahwazis actually goes back a long time. If we're looking at the area of Iran where they live, it's known formally as Khuzestan, but historically amongst the Arabs it was known as Arabistan because of the high proportion of Arabs that live there. And it goes all the way back. There's always been Arabs that lived there. A lot of people like to frame it as, oh, there were no Arabs in the area until the Islamic conquests of the 7th century. It's nonsense, because even the Islamic conquest actually fought against Arab auxiliaries of both the Persians and the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines. They were largely Christian Arab tribes in those areas. So you've always had Arabs, I say always comparatively speaking, obviously, to ancient historical civilizations. But as far as we go in terms of, the classical era moving into the modern era, you've had Arabs, nomadic tribes there, and also settled Arabs who lived dotted around the areas, particularly benefiting from the flora and fauna of the marshlands, which extends into Ahwaz. Iraq is historically known as sometimes they used to call it the black lands, because of the shade of the trees, and the land of the two rivers, because of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers flowing through Iraq, and all the vegetation, the agriculture that caused, and that also feeds into neighboring Ahwaz. There's a lot of marshlands, for example, and Arabs have made a living off of that land for more than 1,000 years at the very least, if not longer. So in more recent years, more recent history, I should say, the area which I just identified as Khuzestan or Arabistan was largely ruled as an autonomous emirate controlled by the Khaz'al tribe. So Sheikh al-Khaz'al, just before the Pahlavi dynasty of Iran came to power, they kind of ruled. They called their own shots, basically, and they lived autonomously. They were neither under Ottoman control or imperial Iranian control. But this began to change as especially in the 1920s, when the Pahlavi dynasty started to gain in prominence and power. So because there was a lot of autonomous principalities around, not just amongst the Arabs, the centralization campaign of the Pahlavis saw them as a threat. And that began a conflict between them, which was, eventually crushed. Sheikh al-Khaz'al, who ruled from Muhammara, which is now known as Khorramshahr in Persian, he was captured, he was taken, imprisoned, basically, and it was annexed to the modern Iranian state. And since then, we've always had secessionist movements rising and being crushed. And this was also going back to what I was saying about Persian nationalism. Even with the advent of the Islamic Republic, that never changed. There was always that element of Persian nationalism, about Persian culture. For example, even the Persian New Year, Nowruz, is celebrated, despite it having no Islamic origin. But that was key to the Iranian government and the regime, because it wanted to encourage that sense of Persian identity. And they can, link it back all the way to Cyrus the Great and so on. So that obviously was at odds with a secessionist movement, essentially, of Arabs, even though the majority of them were Shiites. That's something which is key, and it goes back to how Iran is not necessarily just a Shiite power, and it sees things in a multi-layered way, but it was seen as a threat because these people wanted to restore the autonomy that they enjoyed under the Khazali Emirate. And unfortunately, what that has led to is discrimination against Arabs in terms of their cultural heritage, in terms of being able to publish and to teach Arabic language to their children. And it's also led to crackdowns and human rights violations and executions. And a lot of this is being reported in Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other international bodies. So this is something which is going to be simmering. And we've seen kind of a recalibration recently, even amongst so-called rivals of Iran, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and everything else, who actually supported a lot of these Ahwazi Arab groups. But I think in the long term, we're going to see the Ahwazis become a bit more central to anyone trying to agitate against the Iranians.
Thank you so much, Talha. So, unfortunately, our time is over. It was very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you in our future events. So, for our audience, thank you for your patience and see you all in another series of digital debates. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.